Good evening, and welcome to the newly renovated African American Museum of Iowa. Um, Thank you. A labor of love. I'm Karl Cassell, the executive director here at the museum, and on behalf of our board and staff, it's really great to have you here with us this evening for this exciting event. The renovation project was $4.7 million, and we've had a few updates, as you can see. And what's remained the same is our mission to preserve, exhibit, and teach Iowa's African American heritage, and our vision, which is to bring communities together to foster a deeper appreciation and understanding of our full history. You might have seen we have some traveling exhibits out on display this evening for you, which is the suspended exhibit on the school to prison pipeline, our Iowa Civil Rights exhibit, and in the lobby was our exhibit called Untangling the Roots, about beauty culture and conformity. So if you have time afterwards, feel free to peruse those, but also come back and visit us and explore. The museum welcomes this opportunity to engage you in this important commemoration as we hear from two community leaders this evening. Before the program kicks off, I'd like to thank our sponsors for making this event possible, all of whom have partnered with us on various projects in the past. So the City of Iowa City Office of Equity and Human Rights, the Cedar Rapids NAACP, the Cedar Rapids Civil Rights Commission, and the Marion Civil Rights Commission. Thank you so much for your participation and support. And also thank you to our author, Dr. Dave Markward, who will be introduced momentarily, for his willingness to share with us this evening, and our facilitator, Karl Cassell, for wanting to lead us in tonight's discussion. You might have noticed we are recording this program this evening for future sharing. Restrooms and water fountain, you pass them on the way in. Feel free to take advantage of all the amenities. Refreshments are here. Feel free to get up at your leisure and partake. You might have gotten an index card when you came in. If you have questions and you didn't pick up one, or you have additional questions, I'll be here to pass those out. You don't have to put your name on there, but you can. If we don't get to all of the questions, Dr. Markward said he wants to follow up with you. So if you want to have that opportunity, please include your email address on your card. And then immediately following the discussion, you may purchase a copy of the book. Dr. Markward will be selling them and autographing them for you. All right, so without further ado, it brings me great pleasure to introduce our facilitator for tonight's thoughtful author talk. Karl Cassell was born in Monrovia, Liberia, and grew up in Cedar Rapids. A true West Sider, he graduated from Jefferson High School, where he is a Hall of Famer. After graduating from Iowa State University, he ventured off to the East Coast for several years, returning with a wife, and ready to make a big impact. Having successfully led Jane Boyd Community House, the Cedar Rapids Civil Rights Commission, and Horizons, a Family Service Alliance, Karl launched an executive recruiting firm aimed at securing C-suite professionals of color in more local and national roles, understanding the importance of representation. Karl currently enjoys sharing some of his passions through his YouTube channel, Perhaps Today TV, and is a published author. Karl has been recognized with more accolades than I can count, and has served our community in a number of significant ways over the last 20 years. He currently lends his time, talents, and treasures on the boards of Waypoint Services, Collins Community Credit Union, as a moderator for Ethical Perspectives on the News, and as the board chair for Lynn County Public Health. Of course, the most important aspects of his life are his deep-rooted faith, spending time with his family, and making a difference in our community. So join me in welcoming Karl Cassell as our book facilitator for this evening. Thank you.
Good evening. And I want to first thank the African American Museum and my lovely wife and the staff for the platform that they've given us this evening to discuss this important piece of work, and in celebration of the passing of the 1964 Civil Rights Act by Congress on July 2nd, 1964. Dr. David Markward, we are so very appreciative of your leadership of the Cedar Rapids Community School District, and now your voice in raising awareness of the history of this country and the hopeful future that we know is possible if we're willing to take a hard examination of the past. Finally, I want to thank each of you for being here tonight to participate in this lively discussion. Let's make it that. And hope you have questions here at the end. Those of you who will watch this recording, please share and consider your role in moving this discussion forward. Now, for a bit of housekeeping, before I introduce Dr. Markward, please put your phones on silent, please. So I'll give you guys a chance just to check. So as not to disrupt this event. And now I'm going to introduce Dr. Markward. He has dedicated his professional life to public education, serving as a trusted source of knowledge for over 5 decades. After graduating from Dubuque Senior High School here in Iowa and Augustana, College in Illinois, Dave earned 2 advanced degrees advanced degrees from Western Illinois University and a doctorate from Illinois State University. He started his career as a junior high school science teacher, then served as a coach, principal, school district superintendent, college instructor, and educational consultant. His first book, Free the Teachers, A Guide to Joyful Teaching and Learning, is dedicated to productive education reform. And his latest work, the one we'll be discussing tonight, and one that I would strongly recommend everyone in here reading, From Dubuque to Selma and Beyond, My Journey to Understand Racism in America. Dave delves into the complex world of racism. His memoir is a testament to his unwavering belief in humanity and the power of education to affect change. So with that, Dr. Dave Markward.
Thank you, Karl. It's an honor and a privilege to be here, it truly is. And putting in a plug for the museum, if you have not had a chance to visit before, take the time, make the time to come here. It is an education in and of itself. It's so well done, and the displays are changed periodically. It's a great place to start and or continue your understanding of how race has played an enormous part in our country. So thank you for the invitation to be here. Thanks to each of you for coming out tonight with threatening weather. We were kind of looking, we brought our umbrellas, seeing what we were going to be getting into. And certainly a book doesn't get written by itself. And I want to make a disclaimer right up front. Sometimes when you write something, then people may jump to the conclusion that you think you know all there is to know about a particular subject. When I started, when I came out of Dubuque, I knew about this much about race relations in our country. As I worked and socialized and got to meet people, I knew maybe about that much. And then during the 6 years that I worked on the book, I expanded that a little bit more. So I want to make it clear, this is a journey. You know, I haven't gotten there. I have a long way to go personally. And one of the things I do with the book is invite you to come along on that journey. It's a book of questions for you, questions for all of us. So I want to make that clear. Also, before it went off to the publisher, before I sent the manuscript off, there were 6 people who looked at every word more than once. My 2 older brothers, Ed and Randy, and those of you who have older siblings, I was going to say particularly brothers, but maybe just brothers and or sisters. You understand, I knew I could trust them because they were in the habit of telling me how I could do things a little bit better. So 2 brothers, my very best friend from high school, went on and became a medical doctor and widely read, and I knew I could trust him. A lady named Troyce Fisher, who worked for School Administrators of Iowa, gave me terrific feedback. A guy by the name of Rick Nelson, who taught advanced placement, civics and government, and constitutional law, so I knew he would keep me on the path if I were saying some things that weren't quite accurate. And then there's a lovely lady sitting right there in the front row, Sheila Lehman. And without Sheila along on this ride, there probably would, I could say without fear of contradiction, there wouldn't be a book. And Sheila was not shy at times of saying, looking me in the eye and saying, you know, Dave, I think you can do this a little bit better. So back up the stairs I would go to take another look and maybe get another resource and become a little more accurate. So, you know, the thank yous, none of us do anything by ourselves. And so I've always been hopefully a we rather than an I guy. And that's certainly the case with this book. So thank you all for being here.
So I want to start with a quote from page 339 of Dave's book. And it states, "For those who may believe slavery has been the only injustice visited upon black people in this country, note that these things happened after slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment in 1865. So you spend a considerable amount of time explaining how this fact is ignored amongst the larger populace and treated like the only injustice to African Americans, because you often hear people say, well, slavery is over, has been. Yet you not only cite historical example after example after example, but you personally interview and share your conversations from the many people that you have built relationships with over the last 50, 60 years. I must say, and I've told him probably a numerous amount of times, and others, I was personally touched by your sincerity, your thoughtful and transparent manner in which you described your journey. Most people wouldn't do that simply because it makes you look like, you know, you're still trying to grow, and most people want to act like they've already arrived. Obviously, we know you have multiple degrees. You ran the Cedar Rapids Community School District, but you are still learning and educating yourself. And so I was blown away. And when I first talked to you, I was only 2 chapters in, and I felt like I'd already got an education. And I've since, over time, expressed that. And so I want to thank you for this thought-provoking, well-penned, but more importantly, thoughtful journey that you have given us to treasure. And I'm going to say it again, and I'll say it again and again before we leave. Please read this book, each and every one of you. So the format for tonight, we will spend some time discussing. We'll open up different parts of the book, cite passages through each chapter, add plenty of time for questions and answers. So at the end, again, I know Lanisha has made a point of saying if you have received index cards, please write your questions on. Don't feel like you have to put your name, but if you want your name on the card, do that. But we'll try to spend the last 30 or so minutes reading some of the questions that you guys have so Dave can answer. And with that, we are going to dive into the book. So Dave, let's start with how did the book come about? Were you intending to write a book about racism when you sat down?
No. That could be a pretty short answer to a question, but that's the honest truth. I had no intention. I was watching TV one night, just kind of scanning the channels, and came across the very first episode of David Letterman's new TV program, My Next Guest Needs No Introduction. And his next guest, or that first guest, was Barack Obama. And I had followed President Obama for years. Much of my work was done in Illinois. I was an Illinois senator. I saw him give his speech at the Democratic National Convention. Spellbinding, I thought. So, and I had followed him certainly through the presidency. I thought, I wonder what President Obama's up to. So I wanted to watch this. And it certainly was interesting from that perspective. But there was a smaller segment, a cutaway, and I don't know the technical term, but where Letterman went with John Lewis to Selma. And they were springing off of President Obama's comments about the 50th anniversary of the Edmund Pettus Bridge crossing in Selma. and that 50th anniversary was in 2015. I was watching this show in 2018. And I watched as the two of them walked across the bridge, and John Lewis reenacted that very first march. And I know there are many in the room who know what happened. So as he came across that bridge, he and the others, I think there were 200 or 300 peaceful marchers that day trying to get to Montgomery in protest for voting rights, which is kind of interesting when you think about it in light of today's events. At any rate, he was met with the full force of law enforcement on the other side of the bridge with whips and barbed wire and billy clubs and the whole thing. And John Lewis was nearly beaten to death. And I sat there and I thought, I got to go there. So this was in January of 2018. I said to Sheila, I'm going to Selma. Do you want to go? And she did. And that was the first springboard into taking a closer look at this thing we call racism, this thing that we have such a hard time talking about in our country. So we went to Selma. We stayed in Montgomery. We went to a couple of the museums. I would encourage everyone, if you can, go to Montgomery and learn a bit about our history. The cradle of the Confederacy and the birthplace of civil rights, all in the same place. And we were prepared, we thought, for the march across the bridge. It's preceded in Brown Chapel by an event where they have speakers to talk about the importance of civil rights and voting rights. Someone asked, and I'll hold this up, which you probably can't see, but I'm wearing a tie in the picture. The picture, by the way, Sheila took as we approached the bridge. And someone in a setting similar to this said, Dave, why'd you wear a tie? I said, we're going to church, so I'm going to wear a tie. We didn't get in that day. We would have had to show up about 3 hours before the particular event started, but they had big screens outside and we could see what was going on. And then we, along with 20,000 other people, marched through the streets about a mile from the church down to the bridge. And it was a joyous experience. I mean, we talked to a lot of people, and a lot of people that didn't look like me. And we celebrated the day, and we came up across that bridge, and it is a feeling I've never had before. Envisioning what John Lewis and his cohorts met on the other side of that bridge. So I came home, and one of the things before we left, one of the speakers said, when you go home, let's not just have a celebration, let's not just march, let's not just talk. He said, when you go home, do something. So I came home, I was talking to my brothers, those sage fellows, and they said, you ought to write something about this. So I wrote a little essay, put it on Facebook. It was in a version of it was in the Quad Cities paper. And it was really about the joyfulness of the day. But there was one, if you'll allow me to read from the book, I ended it with this, the essay. Finally, as I sit here today, typing with feelings still very much alive and images vivid, I am puzzled. Why, after all this time and in this great country, is there still an Edmund Pettus Bridge and the need to cross it en masse every year? So with that thought in mind, I started thinking, maybe there's more to this that I should be looking at. And timing is a lot in our lives, and Sheila handed me a book called Stamped from the Beginning. And on the third page of that book, I read these words. The title of Ibram X. Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning, comes from a speech that Mississippi Senator Jefferson Davis, that name should ring a bell, would become the President of the Confederacy, gave on the floor of the U.S. Senate on April 12, 1860. This future President of the Confederacy objected to a bill funding black education in Washington, D.C. Davis lectured his colleagues This government was not founded by Negroes or for Negroes, but by white men for white men. The bill was based on the false notion of racial equality. He declared, the inequality of the white and black races has been stamped from the beginning. Well, I'd lived a little by now at that time in 2018 and had interacted with people that didn't look like me, some of whom are in this room tonight. And I knew that was false, and that served as the springboard for me really starting to delve in and look at this with the intent of going back home and doing something.
So the first chapter of the book, Have You Ever Been Profiled? Consists of a number of interviews. You spend time unpacking conversations with different colleagues and friends, and how relationship with them allowed the conversation to have real transparency, which we appreciate because you let us share a little bit of that. Before that, had you heard phrases or words like the talk, driving while black, white eyes upon me?
I had heard some of them, but they weren't real to me. Certainly as a white person, I couldn't relate to any of those. And I knew they took place, but the difference is when you start talking to people that you know, it makes all the difference in the world. I know there's a lot of people in the room who know Slayton Townsend. And I see a lot of smiles, and that tells me, you know Slayton, because he's a unique guy. And he said, when I asked him that, he said, Dr. Markward, I'm black. I asked Akwi Enji, some of you know Akwi, I asked her, and she said, let me go through my Rolodex of experiences. And so each of the 30 folks of color that I interviewed for the book all had their stories. And some of them were the same, often in a car, some in stores. I see my friend Aaron Green hiding there in the back. He told me a story about getting a receipt. Now, I go into a store and they say, you want your receipt? You know, I'm kind of an environmentalist. I say, no, you know, keep that receipt. Well, Aaron told me quite a different story about getting a receipt. And he said, yeah, I get a receipt. So just last week, we were having lunch, and it was my turn to buy. and the waitress came to the table, and she said, do you want a receipt? And I looked at him, and he looked at me, and we got it because we had talked about it. But those are differences. And when you start talking to people you know, who mean a lot to you, makes a big difference.
You ask a profound question at the end of that chapter, have you ever been profiled because you're white? This is an excellent question. Have you had this discussion with anyone who is white, and what's their perspective?
I wouldn't call it a discussion. The question has come up particularly after I got involved in the research and writing here, and universally, no. Now, we can be profiled for a number of reasons. You know, if you're the third or fourth child and you've got, you know, siblings ahead of you that were this or that in school, there are people who may jump to conclusions about you. I was doing some painting, this was several years ago. Came into the store and I had, you know, jeans on that had paint and a sloppy sweatshirt. And I was looking at some lamps. And the store owner or clerk came over and said, sir, I think you might want to look at these lamps, which were a little less expensive. So, you know, there are those kinds of you know, profiles that are done. But my guess is that each person of color gets up every day and thinks about what their day may look like because they are people of color. Now, you can all answer that. I may be wrong. I don't get up each day and say, what's going to happen to me because I'm white? I mean, and that doesn't mean that white people haven't struggled and overcome, you know, that's where it goes sometimes.
Always.
In that discussion. That's not minimizing that, but that's one thing that a white person, I'll speak for myself, I never think about that. And I don't think that's the case for a lot of my friends. I want to read, if I could.
Please.
When I started interviewing, I started with the people I knew. And then some of those people recommended other people. And so it was interesting. I got to meet people that I'd never met before. And one of them, his name is Dow Jock. Now, some of you are Hawkeye fans, I think. And you may recall the basketball player for the Hawkeyes, Peter Jock. Well, Dow is his older brother. Incredible guy. So here's what if you'll bear with me here a little bit, I'll read a little bit about Dow. Dow was born in Khartoum, Sudan. His father, a general in the People's Liberation Army, was killed during the Second Sudanese Civil War when Dow was 6 years old. Along with his mother and younger brother, he fled Sudan and made his way to America when he was 12 years old. He spoke no English. Incredibly, just 6 years later, he graduated from prestigious Roosevelt High School in Des Moines and then went on to earn a degree in philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. By the way, that's an Ivy League school, and a master's degree from the University of London. Remember, he spoke no English when he was 12 years old. I feel like kind of a piker when I read this. After completing his degrees, he enlisted in the United States Army. He was on active duty for a year in Iraq. Upon returning, he became the company commander of his Army Reserve Unit in Des Moines. He recently completed his doctorate in education from Drake University. Well, what's that have to do with profile? This is what Dow told me. Right after returning from deployment in Iraq, I was walking down the street near my home in West Des Moines. A gentleman who was approaching me left the sidewalk and went across the street, then recrossed the street and returned to the sidewalk after I had passed. I thought, I may have given my life for you during my service to the country, and you treat me like that. It was a very low point for me. That has happened numerous times during the last couple of years. And Karl, you had started talking earlier about slavery and how some people put all that in the past. Well, there are still things that we, as human beings, should be dealing with today. And so that's part of what the work's intent is to do, open some eyes.
Absolutely. So chapter 2, you ask, have you read Uncle Tom's Cabin? You state that Stacy Walker gives great advice when he says, and I love this quote, do the homework before offering opinions. You certainly did in this case. Why did you choose to include this for a chapter of the book?
Can I interject something before?
Plenty. This is your show.
Because this is very serious stuff, but it has been a joyful experience for me. I mean, being able to interact and learn, and it's not all we smile and we laugh and we joke and we do things, right, Karl?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. So I'm going to go meet Stacy Walker. This is in 2021 or so. We're just coming out of COVID, so we come in. Have you had your shots? Yeah. We do that stuff. And I sit across a fairly large table from him. And those of you that know Stacy, I mean, he's like a version of Barack Obama. I mean, the man is put together. I'll put it that way. So we're sitting there, and I want to make sure that I capture every word, so I put my phone there and record, and he just knocks it out of the park. I mean, I can't wait to get out to my car and listen to it, see what he has to tell me. So I get out there, I close the door. I didn't hit the record button. So we've got about an hour and a half of Stacy. So I mentally downshifted. If you know what that term means, or if you've done it, you go numb. I mean, you could have asked me the simplest question, I couldn't have answered it. So I sat there, then I grabbed my legal pad and wrote as much as I could before. And then I called Stacy and I told him what happened. And you know him, gracious. He says, well, we'll just pick it up and we'll go back over whatever it is we need. And so we met 3 or 4 times after that and recovered what I had lost. But in terms of Uncle Tom's Cabin, I had sent him that chapter because I wanted to know what he thought. And he complimented me on the writing, which I appreciated. But here's the point about do the homework before you talk about it. There are many people who dismiss that book. And in fact, the term Uncle Tom has become one of the most derogatory terms you can ever direct at a black person. I would invite you to read the book first. Now, we're not going to get rid of that term as a disparaging term. The water's under the bridge. We're not going to get that back. But in fairness to the book and the writer and what she was trying to accomplish, I would encourage you to take a look and, as I always would, form your own opinion. But before we start talking about stuff, I think we should have an idea of what it is we're talking about. So Harriet Beecher Stowe, little lady about 5 feet tall, an abolitionist. Her father was a minister abolitionist, as were her 5 brothers. And she was writing in reaction to the Fugitive Slave Act, a federal law which, if you were even in the North, if you aided an escaped slave, if you give them shelter, if you fed them, you could be jailed and fined. So when slaves were trying to escape from the South, it wasn't just safe enough to get across the Ohio River into Cincinnati, as an example. Many of them were headed to Canada. So this little lady writes first a series of magazine articles. It's serialized, and then it comes out as 2 published volumes in 1852. Now think about this, 1852. I'm whining sometimes at my keyboard, thinking, oh, this is hard, This little lady had a pen, writing a 500-page book, probably next to a candle. And some of you may know, Tony, help me.
Houghton.
Tony Houghton. He has an original 2-volume set that was published in 1852. And he sent me a picture of it. And it's hermetically sealed. I don't know if he has guards there or not, but it's very valuable. So the lesson is, before we speak, whatever it is, and wow, we see a large dose of just speaking without knowing what the heck we're talking about sometimes in our society. Maybe it's always been there. It seems to be a premium today. But, take a look, see what you think. And certainly there's some language in there that, I would encourage Harriet Beecher Stowe not to use today. It was written in 1852, and she was really trying to do good work to, work against slavery and enhance the abolitionist effort.
And I would say the fact that we don't have any of those folks' names on buildings and schools speaks volumes, but I digress. What were major turning points outside of what you spoke about earlier in taking that journey across the bridge? What were some of the major turning points in your life regarding racism?
Yeah, coming out of Dubuque, and I don't want to disparage Dubuque. I know it's easy to do, and there were some things that took place there in the past. They had some cross burnings. It could be a very inhospitable place for folks of color. For me, growing up, it was a great place to live. I got a great education, and off I went to school. So I'm at Dubuque Senior High, 2,000 students there. By the way, Dubuque Senior High, the only school Karl Cassell scored a touchdown against when he was at Jefferson.
I told him that.
He hastened to tell me that.
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. I'll go.
It's the only touchdown I scored in my life.
Yeah. So I'll go on. So in a school of 2,000, 3 grades at the time, it was before Hempstead was built. So we had a lot of kids there. There are 5 kids of color in the whole school. One was a foreign exchange student from Ethiopia, and one was a foreign exchange student from India. We had 3 other black children in the school, and they were not in our classes. So I had almost no interaction with people of color. There was no opportunity. Played sports, watched sports, they'd come into town. We were in the conference with Moline, Rock Island, Davenport, Cedar Rapids schools, so I would see these splendid athletes. Very little time to talk to them. When someone's knocking you down, you don't say, hey, how's it going? So, So I go off to college, Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois. And the very first day, I'm walking out to the football practice field, and here's this handsome young black man, Tony Clay. And I knew Tony by name because we had played Davenport Central when I was a junior. And they play the fight song after touchdowns, you know. I knew the Davenport Central fight song by the end of the first half. I mean, they had a pretty good night against us. And so I remember Tony, and he was a wrestler, and I'd see him wrestle. Anyway, the very first day we interacted, talked to him last week, friends for 50, however many years that is, and it started to change my perspective because instead of what was being fed to me on TV and movies and cartoons were real people. And that was certainly a human turning point for me.
So, what's in a name? Chapter 4 was one of my favorites. Again, you guys are going to love this book. We could talk a long time about this chapter in and of itself, but what are a couple examples that come to mind in what's in a name? And before you answer, this chapter, as I mentioned just a minute ago about some of the abolitionists not having monuments to their names, we don't know who these folks are. But Dr. Markward, what he does in this chapter in depicting some of the names that are displayed prominently all over this country, in Iowa and other places in the South, was a compelling chapter that really puts in perspective why we idolize the folks we do and make sure that their name and likeness is still in front of us. So please, delve into this.
And this is not in the book, but Viola Gibson Elementary School right here in Cedar Rapids, very instrumental in helping persuade Iowa legislators to support the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So talk about timely today we're celebrating that anniversary. So right here in Cedar Rapids is a school that bears her name. So I think that's certainly worthy of a mention. Started out in Dubuque, going to Marshall Elementary School, and there's a lady sitting right here in the front rows in my kindergarten class, Carol Ricketts-Pierce, who's also was a longtime teacher at Waterloo West, and was a teacher of Nicole Hannah Jones. So the world, we're tied together in ways that sometimes, you just don't expect. So neighborhood school, and we all went home for lunch. So twice a day, I walked in and out of that school, kindergarten through 6th grade. I don't know, that's maybe 1,000 times. I had no idea who this Marshall was. It's prominent on the top of the building. It could have been Marshall Dillon, for all I knew. Some of you younger people will explain who Marshall Dillon is later. But it was named for John C. Marshall. John C. Marshall, longest serving Supreme Court Chief Justice in the history of the United States. I'm thinking, wow, I went to a school named after this guy. And he studied in law schools, his approach to the law and all that kind of thing. Well, he was also a slaveholder. Documented evidence that he had during his life about 300 slaves. Now, I'm not necessarily going to march into Dubuque, Iowa and say we should change the name of the school. But I think we should at least know the names of the institutions, the people for whom they're named, and have a study and talk about them. What's interesting, I told you about Dubuque Senior High. Well, right now, I think the overall enrollment in Dubuque public schools is about 10% minority. The school where I went, Marshall School, has about a 10% minority enrollment there now. So things can change. And I think that's one of the things that I take to heart. Certainly when we went to Montgomery, and there's a town that puts it right out there. I mean, they'll have markers at the slave markets and tell you exactly what was going on. I'd kind of like to take the statue of Jefferson Davis down. It's still outside the Capitol building. But it's for my point of view is it's for the people who live in these places should decide. And they should renew that every now and then and say, is this still what we think we're doing? I've noticed lately a lot of buildings are being named like Maple Bluff, right? Or Cedar Valley or something. So maybe we're learning a lesson. One of the most shocking to me when we were in Nashville, walking down the street, I see Forest Avenue with 2 R's. So I'm thinking, I don't know how to spell, you know. Well, it was named for Nathan Bedford Forrest, who, among other things, was a Confederate officer. He was a slave trader, made immense money trading slaves, and was the first Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan. So I'm thinking, do I want to live on a street named for that guy? Again, and there's been movements to try to get that removed. By the way, he's on more markers in the state of Tennessee than any other individual. So it's kind of our history is interesting if we take a look at it.
Yeah, you'll love that chapter. You consider John Lewis a true hero. And I told you this in one of our discussions. I think it was Nish's second day here at the museum. We had a chance to meet him. And that's how she was welcomed to the museum, by meeting John Lewis. But tell us about you're looking at him as a hero. I know you talk about walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and the reenactment of him being beat with billy clubs within an inch of his life for marching for voting rights. But why? Why for you?
Yeah, there's people probably have more written about him than John Lewis, but starting at an early age, I think he was born in 1940, and then he went off to Fisk College in Nashville. And it's been said that he marched, rode, and sat for civil rights. So he marched in civil rights marches, such as the one that went across the Selma Bridge. He rode, he was one of the Freedom Riders in 1961 on the buses. That incredible bravery. And honestly, there were white and black Freedom Riders. I think of, one of the things that's helped me, I try to put myself in their place and think, how did they do this? And it wasn't like just one day. And then he sat for civil rights. And this is where she and I were walking down the street in Nashville, came across, she said, hey Dave, look, it's a Woolworth. Now, when's the last time you saw a Woolworth building? So we look and we go over and it's under some sort of construction. We look through the big plate glass windows and something caught my eye. Well, there was a little lunch counter there. And on one of the stools was a tan trench coat. And if you've seen the picture of John Lewis being beaten as he comes across the Selma Bridge, he's wearing a trench coat. And I thought, what? And so portrayed in the picture, they had big TVs, and we started to read that this Woolworth was one of the sites of one of the original sit-ins where black folks were not being served in certain restaurants. So, excuse me, if I'd like to read something, because I thought, oh, you know, they go in and they sit in and they get hassled. There's a little more to it than that. Okay. And this was written by a guy named David Halberstam, who would go on to be a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer. So this was in his early career. And he was there watching this and then captured it in words. For more than an hour, the hate kept building up. The hoodlums becoming increasingly bold. The Negroes never moved. First it was the usual name-calling, then spitting, then cuffing, now bolder, punching, banging their heads against the counter, hitting them, stuffing cigarette butts down the backs of their collars. And as I read that, I wondered, what would I do? How long could I sit there? And would I have come back to do it again? So one of my great regrets, I'm a little bit jealous, you know, you got to meet the great man. We saw him twice. We went back to Selma in 2022 and saw John Lewis from afar, and we knew a lot more about him at that time. And I did contact his congressional office in Atlanta and in Washington in hopes that I would have hopped on a plane at a moment's notice to go meet this guy. That's in what high regard I hold him. And they responded, and then I didn't follow through. And it's, you know, and then, you know, in a short time after that, he left us. So one of my great regrets. But I just don't think there's a more heroic American, beaten over 20 times, arrested over 40 times, and never gave up the idea of peaceful protest, nonviolent protest. That's hard to do,
Yeah,
you know, when someone's beating on you. So yeah, he's up there.
Wow, and now I get to be jealous. As a track guy, you got to meet Jesse Owens as a teenager. Why do you hold him in such high regard?
Oh boy, yeah. I was in, after my 9th grade year, he was invited by the Sports of Sorts Club in Dubuque, Iowa to come. We had it was part of the qualification for the Chamber of Commerce state track meet. So they'd have regional meets, and one was in Dubuque. And you had to qualify for the meet, and I was fortunate to qualify. And we were invited to a dinner that night to meet Jesse Owens. And he looked, you know, he's in his 50s probably at that time. He looked like he could have taken his suit off and beaten everybody in the room, you know. He was still in great shape. And I'd seen the black and whites of him, the stories when he, you know, went to the 1936 Olympics in Nazi Germany. You know, all those kinds of things. In 1935, in the Big Ten Championships,
Ohio State.
in Ann Arbor, Michigan, he set 4 world records in track and field in 45 minutes. Sports Illustrated called it the greatest 45 minutes in the history of sport. Be hard to argue that's not true. So I'd read a bit about him, and he came, and I was fortunate enough to win. They called it the broad jump at that time. Fortunately, they changed the name to long jump. I think that was a wise move. And so as you won, or you know, they had a little medal ceremony. I got to shake his hand. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is Jesse Owens, you know. And so I followed his career, and then as I started working on the book, I delved more deeply into his life and the hardships he endured, including when he came back from the Berlin Olympics. They were feeding him at a banquet in one of the fancy New York hotels. He and his wife had to take the freight elevator up in the back of the hotel to go into the dining room. He did a lot of things to raise money. He ran, they'd have him run against horses for money. And someone said, well, you know, that's kind of undignified. But, you know, why are you doing that? He said, you can't eat 4 gold medals. And so I just became enamored with the man. And to think that, you know, I got to actually meet him was a highlight. And I think you maybe ask, I know what you'll
Yeah,
do
please
here.
read that quote from page 162 and 63, please. And why he looks that up, he talks about Jesse Owens and his wife going up the freight elevator. We know in modern day, you win a gold medal, or you win a national championship, or you win an NBA championship, NFL championship, you go to meet the president. Did Jesse Owens get to meet the president after winning gold medals in Berlin, Germany? I think we all know the answer. Please.
In March of 1980, I was coaching track and field at Moline High School when I received the news that, Jesse Owens had died in Tucson, Arizona at the age of 66 due to lung cancer. His life of struggle and remarkable achievements were fittingly summed up by President Jimmy Carter. The news of Jesse Owens saddens our nation. Perhaps no athlete better symbolized the human struggle against tyranny, poverty, and racial bigotry. His personal triumphs as a world-class athlete and record holder were the prelude to a career devoted to helping others. His work with youth athletics, as an unofficial ambassador overseas and a spokesman for freedom are a rich legacy to his fellow Americans. And after I read that, here's what I wrote. The black and white images of Jesse Owens I had seen on TV are now forever joined by those I personally saw in living color. He was truly a humble man whose path to the finish line in life was simultaneously swift and painfully arduous. Jesse Owens.
You dedicated your professional life to public education, so it's not surprising that 2 of the 9 chapters address education in America, and at times specifically Iowa. Please share a couple of examples of our history that reveal how, in your terms, America hands out its life's chances in ways that continue to perpetuate the struggle for many people of color to get an education they need and deserve in our country.
That's a big question with a big answer. For most of us, education is the key to whatever we want to do and whatever we've done. I mean, it's where all this start and where we get that guidance. And to shortchange anyone is to shortchange ourselves. Heather McGee has written a book, The Sum of Us, and it's spelled S-U-M. The addition. It's not a zero-sum game. If you help someone, you're not diminished. You know, you get the joy of helping. And also, the promise that as you help that person, they at some time are going to give back. Maybe not to you. And by give back, I don't necessarily mean money. Who knows? You give a kid an opportunity, they may come up with the next great invention that saves our lives in somehow or saves the planet. So education to me is a lot of what we do. And I've always said the biggest room in the house is the room for improvement. And so we've really got to look at where we are. And when I worked with teachers, often I would say, are you satisfied with what we're doing today? And most would say no. And when we say no, that suggests that you have to go out and do things differently. And I certainly think as our nation appears to be pulling apart in all different directions, we certainly need to pull ourselves back together, make sure that the beacon of hope for all children through education exists and gives them a fair shot. Historically, more to the question, one of the biggest examples of foot dragging and turning our back on particularly people of color in this country educationally was after the passage of the Brown versus Board of Education cases in 1954 and 1955. Prince Edward County in Virginia closed their public schools, diverted public funds to private charters, would not allow black children to attend those charter schools for 4 years. Now, I would challenge anyone to tell me how that helps any of us to keep children from being educated. As late as 2016, there were still cases being tried in the state of Mississippi where districts were not integrating and continued to segregate. So you say, well, what does that have to do with today? Educational savings accounts, vouchers. And let me be very clear. I support all schools. Private schools, Catholic schools, all private schools. I think some of them are doing wonderful jobs, but not with public funds. Public funds are for public purposes. If you don't like the public golf course, go join a private one. If you don't like swimming with kids in the public pool, there's places you can go do that. But I really think the damage that will be done, and it's just starting, to our public school system, and I'm not saying the public school system is perfect. We've got a lot of work to do, a lot of work to do. But if those funds continue to be diverted, I think we're going to see a reenactment in some ways of what went on in the 50s and those years after. There's going to be a separation by race, not exclusively, but in some places. And I think in the state of Iowa, there's something like, it's over 40 counties that do not have private schools. So what do you even do about that? Now, if there's great things going on in private schools, let's share the ideas. If there's great teaching in XYZ school, I'd sure like to know it. So I'm not against private schools. I'm very much for public schools. And I think we need to take a longer vision of what we're doing to try to educate all of our kids or more of our kids.
So coming to the moment, or today, well, first, if anyone wants index cards to write questions, please, Lanisha has those, so just a reminder. But as we look at today, there is a lot of talk at in state legislatures and school districts about critical race theory. Why the fear of this in America, and why is it under attack from your perspective?
Critical race theory is one thing, and if we go back to Stacey Walker's suggestion that we do the homework first, I think there's been a lot of conversation about critical race theory without having any idea what it is. And I will tell you, the first time I heard it, I had no idea what it was because it's not taught in our schools.
Right.
It was a graduate study pursuit to take a look at our society, at systemic racism, and to determine if there really was such a thing. It was not being espoused in our schools in any degree. I'm going to, if I could, add the 1619 Project in there. Nicole Hannah-Jones, West Waterloo High School graduate, writes this beautiful, it first came out in the New York Times Magazine edition. Sheila got me the copy, of course, told me to read it, so I did. Then it later became a book, and it's another book that we should all read. And like just about every book I've ever read, there's some things that I question in there. But it is a great work to put in play and talk about because it gets us looking at things and uncovering our history rather than covering it up. My son is a principal of a K-8 school just south of Chicago. 95% of the children there are black, 95% of them are on free and reduced lunch. When I hear about not teaching certain parts of history, I'm thinking, we can't teach those children their own history?
Right.
What's fair about that? I look at little Ruby Bridges. Maybe you know the story about Ruby. 8 years old in 1960. She breaks the color barrier in Louisiana as an 8-year-old going to school, escorted by marshals every day. What kind of courage is that?
Right.
And then, of course, the Little Rock Nine go in and the things they put up with, and then went on to do great things if given the opportunity. So, yeah, education certainly holds the key, has for me, I'll tell you that, and I think it does for most of our kids.
So you say education does not exist in a vacuum. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. Things like nutrition, healthcare, the conditions under which people live all contribute. So I would ask the question, I like to ask questions. Would you like children to come to school not well fed? Would you like them to come to school not having a place to do their homework or not having a home in which there are books? What we wish for our own children, we should wish for all children and work toward that end, it seems to me. And that's going to take a mighty effort because there are some people in play out there who have way different motives than trying to help educate all of our kids. And so, you know, I think it starts with educating ourselves, educating our kids, keeping open minds, having conversations with people that are not like us to learn about their conditions and help them.
Read the quote on page 273 by Marian Anderson, if you don't mind.
I will. And Marian Anderson was the first African-American to perform in the Metropolitan Opera. Anybody want to guess the year? I would have been way off. 1955, but good guess, good guess. No matter how big a nation is, it is no stronger than its weakest people. And as long as you keep a person down, some part of you has to be down there to hold them down. So it means you cannot soar as you might otherwise. And I think that's a simplistic notion that carries so much weight.
Isn't she the one that sang in front of the Lincoln Memorial? Yes. It caused a big stir? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So pick a passage from the book that has had the most profound effect on your thinking.
I'm going to ask I'm going to do this. How are we doing on time? Because we want to make sure that you have time to ask your questions. So we want to be
It's close to 7, so
okay?
a couple more minutes.
Okay.
Yeah,
all right.
Yeah.
When Sheila and I were in Montgomery the second time, we went to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. Oh my gosh. I know some of you have been there, and it's quite a place. The nation's first memorial dedicated to the legacy of enslaved black people terrorized by lynching. And lynching is death without due process. So there are a number of ways that can take place. When I first thought of lynching, I thought of by hanging. And there have been many, many, many of those. You may know the story of Emmett Till, who was killed in 1954, dragged out of his uncle's home, who was visiting in the South, brutalized, shot in the head. They tied a big farm fan around him and threw him in the Tallahatchie River. That's a lynching. This is one that caught my eye, and Sheila's as well, because we're teachers. And according to the record, more than 4,000 African-American men, women, and children were hanged, burned alive, shot, drowned, or beaten to death by white mobs between 1877 and 1950. And there's records of still more after that date. This is the one that caught our eyes. Elizabeth Lawrence lynched July 5th, 1933 in Jefferson County, Alabama. During this era, African Americans could be lynched for any perceived social transgression, including speaking disrespectfully to a white person, refusing to step off the sidewalk as a white person approached, or using profanity. On July 5th, 1933, Elizabeth Lawrence, a school teacher, was walking home in Jefferson County, Alabama, when a group of white children threw rocks at her. Ms. Lawrence verbally reprimanded the children and continued walking. Later that evening, an angry mob went to Ms. Lawrence's home, seized her, and burned her house to the ground. She was lynched that night for her perceived social transgression. I thought about that. And here's what I wrote. As I stood before the plaque, once again I thought, what if Mrs. Lawrence had been my wife, sister, mother, grandmother, or great-grandmother? What if she had been my daughter? I wondered if Elizabeth Lawrence could have been a relative to the black people I have come to know. When I personalize events in this way, it helps me better understand the continuing anger and rage among black people when events of today signal things haven't changed as much as we'd like them to think they have. And so I have started to make connections of the past in what we still have to do today.
I'm going to end with one last question. You end the book with a chapter entitled, Is There Hope? Mm-hmm. Do you really believe there is hope?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's the longest chapter in the book, by the way.
Yes, it
so,
is.
There is some hope in there, and I spell out the reasons why I think there are. Let's look at tonight. You got a white guy who was born and raised in the 50s and 60s in Dubuque, Iowa. Sitting here, right? Yeah, I think there is hope, and we're all part of that. You know, you can be hopeful or not, and I choose to get up each day and say, what are the things I can do to help make this place maybe a little better? So that's my thought.
So it is 7 o'clock. We certainly want to give you, the audience, an opportunity to ask any questions. So if you would and could, please pass your cards to Lanisha. And there's still time while the questions are coming to the aisle to write one down. And also, for the audience, we thank you for your time and attention tonight. Dr. Markward will certainly be available to sign copies of his book. I think are they doing that in the lobby or in here?
There's a table.
In here. So, and know that all the profits from this book, he will be given to the museum, which is a testament to who he is. So please feel free to spread the word, and again, as I stress, please read this book. When you were reaching out to request conversations with persons of color, how did you introduce your intentions to write this book, A White Man Writing About Race?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it was on my mind. Am I, not that there's the right person, am I a right person as a white man to write about these events and share, when I've written some things that get shared within a school district or in a classroom. When you write a book, you don't know where those thoughts are going to go. So I thought hard about that, and I asked some of my colleagues that I was interviewing, what do you think? And many encouraged me to do that you can provide a perspective that we cannot. And at that time, that was a leap of faith on their part because they had no idea what was going to go into the book. And I've gotten some pretty good feedback that, leave it up to you to decide on your own that, there's accuracy. One of the books I was reading at the time I was writing, it's called, it's by John Feinstein, and it's called Raise a Fist, Take a Knee. And it's kind of a history of black athletes in sport. And at the very beginning, in the introduction, Feinstein asked Doug Williams, the first black quarterback to play in the Super Bowl, to write the introduction. And in the introduction, Williams said something like this. John Feinstein asked me if he, as a white man, should write this book. And I told him, if I did it or if another man of color did it, it may be perceived as just another black man whining. Now, those are Doug Williams' words, not mine. And so that put a little wind in my sails that, yeah. And then, again, those that I've interviewed, gave me positive feedback. And so I think it's a fair question. I'll leave it up to everyone to answer it, as they see fit. But that was kind of the reasoning behind why I continued to pursue it.
And keep the questions coming because I've read through them and they're pretty good. So what now? What do you plan next to continue your journey?
Continue having those conversations. The world has not stopped spinning. I think you've probably noticed that. When I sat down to write the book, and through the first several months, you think, is there enough here to write a book? And there's less in the book than there is in my files. So there's a lot. You have to make a decision what can go in, what seems to make sense, but obviously the topic is so broad and deep that I have the intent of following that up. I truly hope it doesn't take 6 years. I've learned a few things along the way that might help move it along a little bit more quickly, but there's still many more stories to tell and a lot more work to do, that's for sure. And I believe I'll probably be doing this till I'm not doing anything any longer.
No, we hope that doesn't happen anytime soon. White Christian nationalism appears to be gaining a lot of power in our country. At times it feels hopeless that we are going backwards. How do we overcome this movement?
Yeah, I've learned not to speak about things I don't know a lot about. So I've watched the phenomenon with questions, as I'm sure many of you have. And, I have a simple question back. When I was the superintendent at Rock Island, there was a man who would come in and we had some spirited conversations. And I noticed one day he had a bracelet on, WWJD. And I didn't know what that meant one day. And so I said, what is that on your bracelet? He said, well, that stands for what would Jesus do? And to me, that's such a real simple answer. When anybody sits down to make a decision about, a law, or how are you going to treat people, or those kinds of things, there's no better example, right? Than to ask yourself, there's no better question, what would Jesus do? And then I think more often than not, to go do that is probably the right thing to do. So I don't have a lot of technical, verbiage to push back. I see what you're talking about, Karl, and others, and I've read the same articles, and I scratch my head, and I try not to be judgmental, but I have to say that sometimes I'm thinking, how could you make this decision, or how could you do that? So those of us who feel differently have to use our voices, right, and our votes, and whatever else we can do to turn that around, if that's our conviction.
And here's a comment on the book, The Sum of Us. She caused the big stir. She just sang. The white audience caused the stir. Mm. Thank you for whoever wrote that. That is proper perspective.
And I would say part of the white audience.
Yes, absolutely.
There's I'm going to digress here a little bit, but I think it was in the 80s. I'm looking at Scott and Marcia because they know all these movie things. But there was a movie, I think it was made for TV. It was called Gettysburg. And Jeff Daniels played the part of Colonel Chamberlain, who came enlisted in the Union Army, became an officer. He's from Bowdoin College in Maine. And there's a lull in the fighting, and they're sitting on a hillside. Colonel Chamberlain and his first sergeant, who appears to be, he's an Irishman by name, in flowing red hair and the big red mustache and mutton chops. So they're talking about the Civil War and what they're fighting for. And, the idea of slavery comes up. And Jeff Daniels or Colonel Chamberlain says, well, what do you think? What do you make of this? And the first sergeant said, anyone who judges the group anyone who judges the individual by a group is a peewit, meaning someone with a small brain. And that has stuck with me. We are all individuals, and we certainly belong to some groups, but we're not all the same within those groups. And so I think, treating each other as individuals. There's a quote in the book, go out and have a conversation with someone who doesn't look like you. It may change your world. And that certainly had an impact on mine.
Someone said, thank you for your book. How do you use your experiences and knowledge to address immediate racism as it happens in front of you?
Well, that's a really good question. And I'm probably not as effective as I should be or could be. I've gone from someone who knew better, when I learned to know better, who sometimes sat quiet and didn't, because the prevailing attitude, these are your buddies and they're saying these things. I'm more likely now. And of course, now they know me a little better, and they know I wrote a book, so they're less likely to say those things. You know, that kind of happens too.
He's one of those guys.
Yeah, but I think, you know, it's not just, you know, you don't have to wear a white robe and burn crosses to you know, be part of bad things. So part of it is standing up, so to speak, when things are, as you think, unfair and hurting individuals. And so that's a simple answer, but that's how I look at myself as maturing through life. Someone has said we're on a racism continuum. So when I was in Dubuque, I was what I would call an ignorant racist. I wasn't malicious. I wasn't targeting people. I wasn't saying things. But I said things out of ignorance. I think I've moved along that continuum. I'll leave others to decide. I know what's in my heart, what's in my head. And whether you get there, you know, when somebody says, I don't have a racist bone in my body, well, that's a pretty good place to start looking. Because I think as human beings, we all have some of those things that we deal with. And it's the willingness to take them on and say, wow, you know, I was thinking that, and then put it through a little different filter and say, no, you know, that's just the way it is with this person.
You did not mention one of the unintended consequences of Brown v. Board of Education. The closing of black schools and loss of jobs for black teachers. Are there still consequences today that we need to consider as we try to be anti-racist?
Yeah, and that's book 2.
Stay tuned.
Because there is, you know, the Reader's Digest version of the Brown decisions is, and then everything was good.
Right.
And there's just a lot more to it. Not only the delayed integration of schools, which I addressed earlier, but what then happened to black teachers and administrators. And I've just started to scratch the surface there. But thousands of fully qualified black educators were released from their jobs as schools became integrated. And those jobs were given then, as the schools grew, to white teachers. And when the black kids left the predominantly black or totally black schools, those teachers were left behind and not given jobs. And it's more complicated than that, but it's certainly part of what happened. And that deserves a much closer look.
And there are plenty of books and articles and writings from people about the unintended consequences of integration. Because all those black businesses, those black communities changed literally in a span of a decade or two. Thriving communities because integration. There were a lot of people who were against in the black community against integration because they knew we would lose a portion of ourselves. And so this is so multifaceted, but I would challenge everyone, read on the perspectives because to Stacy Walker's comment, that you shouldn't really speak on something until you actually do your own research. What lessons from Selma would you pass along to future educators? Example, junior high science teachers, superintendents, and someone said, thank you for sharing your wisdom.
Yeah, keep at it. You know, those folks that were on the ridge that day, that wasn't a one-act deal. You know, they kept at it. If there's anything I learned by playing football, you get knocked down, you get back up, you know, you go at it again, hopefully a little smarter, so you maybe had a little bigger gain the next time. But there's a tendency, and I may get a little far afield here, but there's a tendency with our young folks, I think, that I'm seeing, and we've created this, by the way, and I don't mean that we should create struggles for them intentionally, but we've tried to pave the way so much that I'm concerned when they first meet their struggles, are they going to be equipped to to meet them and understand, and because struggle is part of what we all do in life. And not unfair, by the way, not unfair struggles, but those things, to learn to work hard and stay at it, and you don't always get what you want, those kinds of things. So you got to mix all that into as we look at the future too. So, stay at it.
What are some explicit things I can do to make change as a youth?
As a youth.
As a youth.
The first thing is, I would tell them the same things I tell my kids, and get your homework done. There's no shortcut. It shouldn't be in school. Some kids are brilliant and don't have to do any of that stuff, but I would tell them to do that. And it's really difficult because some of the situations I've read about in schools, it's like the tinderbox, and things flare up pretty quickly, sometimes between two kids, and it's escalated into a physical altercation. So trying to keep one's cool would certainly be something that I would encourage. In your own way, demand fairness. Stand up when you think you're being treated unfairly. And that's easy for me to say because I would have to look long and hard, and I couldn't come up with an example where I thought I was treated unfairly. Maybe when mom and dad sent me to my room, or something like that. But in life, I've worked hard, I've gotten great opportunities. I just can't point to things where I said, I was really treated unfairly. And so it's easy for me to say that. But I think in the long run, being able to hang in there, speak up for yourself. I always told kids, part of my job, or one of the jobs, I was an assistant principal, and that was I dealt with discipline on a regular basis. And I said, you're not going to get an education by being removed from school. So what can we do? And hopefully we have understanding school people and teachers to help kids stay in school. To me, obviously as an educator, I guess, but that's really important. And so we've got to figure those things out too.
Final question. A person has to want to learn to become more knowledgeable. Learning is to become more empathetic. And that's the comment.
Yeah, your empathy grows, and I have to be careful. I don't use the word empathy. In the very few first pages of the book, I say I cannot empathize with my black friends. I have not been in their shoes. I can try to understand, I can try to feel what they're feeling. I have not had the experiences they have. So empathy is a word that I think it's well intended, but I think we have to be careful in its use, but trying to understand where the other person is coming from. Can I give a short quote here?
Please.
Yeah. Do we have any Ted Lasso fans? Yeah.
There's a few.
So I'm reluctant to bring that up because they should take some of the bad words out of there on Ted Lasso. But the lessons in those episodes they're really life lessons. And they apply, it's an interracial cast. I thought it was really well done. The last episode, season 3, episode 12, this is my words first, I share this quote that acknowledges our past and gives a realistic belief in better days ahead. And this was Ted Lasso. I hope that either all of us or none of us is judged by our actions in our weakest moments, but rather by the strength we show if and when we're given a second chance. And I would say our second chance is now.
A round of applause for Dr. Markward, please.
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming out. Thank you again to Dr. Markward and to Karl for this engaging conversation. I also want to acknowledge and thank again our sponsors, the City of Iowa City Office of Equity and Human Rights, the Cedar Rapids NAACP, the Cedar Rapids Civil Rights Commission, and the Marion Civil Rights Commission. And thank you all for being here. Please feel free to meet Dr. Markward at the table over there if you're interested in one of his books. And also help yourself to the refreshments. Thank you.
Very good, sir.